Welcome to Didactic, CAPS Board Study Edition. I'm your host, Dr. O'Leary, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed to help myself and other child and adolescent psychiatry fellows study for their boards. But anybody interested in human development and mental health will get something out of it. For a rundown on how it's produced, please see Episode 1. I use AI to assist me with the content creation, and Episode 1 explains how I do this. Now, even though I'm using AI, all the content in this podcast should be considered to be my opinion and no one else's. So if there are any mistakes, those are my mistakes. And if you find errors in the content or you have suggestions for improvement, I would love it if you went to didactic.com and filled out a form there and let me know. In the last episode, I introduced behavioralism, which took a strikingly different approach to human learning and development by basically assuming that everything we are on the inside is somehow learned from the environment, except for some of those most basic things we need to survive and learn. Our inner life and the reasons we give for our decisions are more or less illusions. What we are is what we are conditioned by our environment to be. I started with classical conditioning, Pavlov, dogs, and scaring babies. So go back to the last episode for that. Today, I'm going to move on to Skinner and other researchers who liked to put animals into boxes and even shock them into complacency, which might be ethically worse than scaring babies with loud sounds. However, shocking dogs later helped to lead Martin Seligman to a much brighter place, positive psychology. So let's get started. While classical conditioning was focused more on inducing physiological or innate responses in animals and humans when there was a conditioned stimulus presented with an unconditioned stimulus, operant conditioning is more concerned with influencing what appears to be voluntary choices. So how do we make choices? In general, how do we learn? Some of the researchers include B.F. Skinner, Edward Thorndike, and Clark Hall, and each made their own contributions to our understanding of this. But their common focus was really on observable behaviors and environmental influences. The first researcher I'm going to talk about today is Edward Thorndike, and he worked in the late 1800s until the mid-1900s. So he conducted experiments by placing cats into puzzle boxes, and the cats had to learn how to get out of the box and then receive a reward. The ideas he formulated were called the law of effect, which basically stated that behaviors that were followed by satisfying consequences are more likely to be repeated, while those followed by unsatisfying consequences are less likely to be repeated. So that sounds a lot like Skinner's operant conditioning. Thorndike provided early evidence for the role of consequences in learning. So he helped shift the focus of psychology towards observable behavior and away from talking about or speculating about internal processes. So he placed cats in puzzle boxes, and they could only escape if they performed a very specific action like pulling a string or pressing a lever. So initially the cats would just engage in different behaviors called trial and error behaviors. They just try different things, and over time they would learn to escape more quickly when they started to associate better, like pressing the button or pulling the lever, with being able to get out of the box. So this became the law of effect. After Thorndike came B.F. Skinner, and Skinner is best known for really formalizing operant conditioning, and he used a Skinner box to do this. So in these experiments, animals, usually rats or pigeons, had to perform specific actions like pressing a lever or hitting a button with their beak in order to receive a reward, or to avoid a punishment like an electric shock. So Skinner emphasized the importance of reinforcement and punishment in shaping behavior. So he argued that behaviors followed by a positive consequence are more likely to be repeated. Reinforcement, that's a lot of what Thorndike was talking about with his law of effect. But those followed by negative consequences are less likely to be repeated. and a negative consequence can be called a punishment. So he stressed the role of these environmental factors in controlling our behavior and really did not think that people had free will at all. He thought that we kind of just responded to our environment and learned how to get the best out of it. And that ended up being called operant conditioning. And operant conditioning has had a huge effect in education, in the therapies we give people, how we organize institutions, how we pay people. We now know that you can provide rewards and people will respond to them. This is how video games get kids to play for like 6 hours straight and for getting to eat and for getting to use the restroom. Kind of as an aside here, but something I think was really cool, was Skinner's superstitious behavior experiments. So in these experiments, Skinner placed pigeons in a box and just delivered the food at a fixed interval, regardless of what the pigeon did. So this caused the pigeon to do all sorts of weird things, like turn in circles and peck at different places on the floor, and it seemed like they were associating their actions with the delivery of food, even though there was no actual connection. Pigeons developed what could be called superstitious behaviors. Anyway, that's somewhat of an aside, but I thought a pretty cool one. The last person I'm going to talk about today is Martin Seligman. Now, he's a researcher who started out as a behavioralist, and then he became one of the founders of the positive psychology movement. Seligman's research focused on a concept called learned helplessness. And a lot of people think this has profound implications for understanding depression, or conversely, promoting resilience in people. So Seligman, like Skinner and Thorndike, put animals in boxes, and he shocked them. But that's not very shocking to us now, is it? No matter what the animal did, they could not avoid the electric shocks. So over time, they learned that their actions had no effect on the outcome. So they didn't become superstitious, they became complacent. And even when they were presented with opportunities to escape, often they just remained passive and helpless. Now, fast forward quite a bit, and Seligman further developed this concept of learned helplessness into an explanatory framework for how people deal with things in their life. For example, people who tend to have sort of pessimistic explanatory styles, who externalize the reasons for them not getting what they want in life, are probably going to act in a more helpless way and be more prone to things like depression. The corollary of that is, if we can get people to focus on positive things, if we can get them to feel, or at least to talk about how their actions can impact the world, we may be able to improve depressive symptoms. We may be able to improve motivation and reduce anxiety. We do this by increasing optimism in hopes that we can build resilience. When something bad happens, people don't think, there's nothing I can do about it. Why try? They think, hey, there's another setback. What do I need to do to get back on my feet again? This is positive psychology, and it shifted the focus of treatment from human weakness and impairment to human strength and well-being. It started to talk about things like what it means to flourish in life. Overall, these are pretty different views of operant conditioning, but let me just kind of go over in a nutshell what operant conditioning has taught us. It taught us that there are reinforcing things and punishing things. Reinforcing things are things that we desire. Punishing things are consequences that we don't want to happen. Reinforcement can be a positive reinforcement where something is added, or it could be a negative reinforcement where something we don't like is removed. If those dogs were shocked and they could push a button and that would stop the shock, that would be a negative reinforcer. It would take away a thing that had hurt them. Punishment can be positive or negative too. Positive is when something is added to a thing, right? So a positive punishment is when something undesirable is added, and a negative punishment is when something desirable is taken away. For example, if you were to take away a video game from a kid, that would be a negative punishment. You could think during development there might be some applications for these. For example, in feeding, you might offer praise or give someone their favorite toy or something they really like to eat after they eat something that they aren't all that excited about. That would be a positive reinforcement. You could also have a negative reinforcement by maybe removing some food they really don't like if they'll eat their potatoes, which they don't want to, but they don't hate as much as that other food. So that could be a negative reinforcement. For potty training, you can give praise and rewards to kids for using the potty, and the kid might also be getting negative reinforcement by having this nasty wet diaper not on them all the time. When caregivers praise kids for being nice, sharing their toys, this is positive reinforcement. If a caregiver takes away a toy because kids are fighting over it, that is a negative punishment. For operant conditioning to work, the consequences have to be delivered very close to the time that of the action you want to change. So there is timing issues here. You can't do it later. No one will know what's happening. It also has to be consistent. If you don't do something consistently, then learning gets confused. There are a lot of individual differences too. So it varies on the child's, for example, temperament and their attachment to the person giving the reinforcement or the punishment. So let me wrap up today by comparing a little bit the differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning focused on the association between two stimuli, and one of those was a neutral stimulus, and it was paired with an unconditioned stimulus. And the unconditioned stimulus naturally elicited an unconditioned response. But after you paired that neutral stimulus with the unconditioned response long enough, then it became a conditioned stimulus. It elicited the same response, the unconditioned response, that the original unconditioned stimulus caused. That's a lot of words, and it always gets jumbled up in my mind. So you may have to listen to that over and over again. But the response types in classical conditioning are involuntary reflexive responses, things like salivation or fear. It's not so much learning how to do a new thing as it is associating one thing with another. Operant conditioning is learning through consequences. So behaviors are strengthened or weakened depending on the consequences. Reinforcement should increase the likelihood of a behavior, and punishment should decrease the likelihood of a behavior. The responses are more voluntary and goal-directed, things like pressing a lever to get out of a box or to get a reward, turning in your homework so that you can get an A. One thing that's true about both is they both require an acquisition phase, where it takes some time of pairing things together for the person or animal to learn. And then they both have an extinction phase where the learning response can get weaker if the reinforcement's removed or if the pairing is not done anymore. And then in both there can be spontaneous recovery where an extinguished response suddenly reappears for some reason. There's also the concept called generalization that I talked about with classical conditioning in the last show. But generalization is basically where the response occurs to stimuli or can be generalized to other similar situations. So if hitting a button helped you get out of the cage in one situation, if there was something that kind of resembled the button but isn't exactly there, you might try pushing that more quickly. Your conditioning could be generalized. And then there can be processes of discrimination, and what that means is that things that are very similar but not entirely the same can be discriminated between, where one consistently gives the stimuli and the other, even though generally is about the same, doesn't. Over time, the salient features of those can be learned, and you can discriminate between two similar things. Basically, we have the focus of classical conditioning being the association between stimuli, and the focus of operant conditioning being the association between a behavior and its consequences. In classical conditioning, the responses are involuntary reflexive responses. In operant conditioning, they're voluntary and goal-directed. In classical conditioning, the role of the learner is a lot more passive. They're just experiencing a thing. But in operant conditioning, the role is active. There is trial and error. In order to come up with this sort of law of associations or law of effect. And in classical conditioning, the consequences occur regardless of the learner's behavior. The learner's behavior does not affect the consequences. They're innate. But in operant conditioning, the consequences do depend on the learner's behavior. So in classical conditioning, the key terms are an unconditioned stimulus, an unconditioned response, a conditioned stimulus, and a conditioned response. But in operant conditioning, the words are reinforcement and punishment, positive and negative. Positive, something is added. Negative, something is taken away. Thanks for hanging out with me today. In the next episodes, I'm going to move on to talking about the different disorders and the different kinds of things that child and adolescent psychiatrists might have to treat. For example, mood disorders or oppositional disorders. But the place we're going to start is in neurodevelopmental disorders. Thank you for listening. This has been an episode of Psydactic, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.